Final week of Parliament for the year has involved an avalanche of legislation. Most of it has been well ventilated and debated over recent weeks and months. Think social media age limits or changes to the Reserve Bank board structure. But there was a batch of bills involving tough immigration rules that didn't receive as much attention. Now, these changes involved new deportation powers, travel bans, confiscation powers in detention centres. They're due to whip through with bipartisan support, despite the howls of protest from various human rights groups. Right now, it's lunchtime on Thursday as we record this, and by the time you're listening, these bills are likely to have been passed by the Senate. But I'm still curious to find out more about what they involve and what these changes will mean in practice. That's what I'd like to explore. I'm David Speers on Ngunnawal Country at Parliament House in Canberra. Welcome to Insiders on Background. Well, Dr Abul Rizvi is a former Deputy Secretary of the Department of Immigration. He was awarded the Public Service Medal and the Centenary Medal for services to the development of immigration policy. Dr Rizvi, good to see you. Thanks so much for joining me.
Hello, David.
So let's start with the bills that are passing through the Senate today, before we then come to the reform the government was unable to get through on foreign student caps, because that was a curious decision for the Coalition to oppose that as well. But on these three bills, look, some of it was discussed over the last 12 months, and a lot of this relates to the decision that was, funnily enough, 12 months ago tomorrow from the High Court, the NZYQ decision that they made, and that led to the release of more than 200 people from immigration detention, some of them with serious criminal convictions. So the three changes, these three bills we're talking about, what stands out to you? Perhaps we go through them. One of them is a deportation power. How will this apply to those in the cohort, this NZYQ cohort?
That particular bill has been drafted much more broadly than was necessary. It's covering a lot of people who are already subject to removal.
Right.
The key target in this group is around 200, perhaps 300 people who have been subject to, who have committed serious crimes and whom the government has not been able to deport.
So under this change, they could pay a third country, presumably Nauru or Papua New Guinea, and just send them there?
That's right. And I do find that quite distasteful. It's essentially saying these people are too dangerous to live in the Australian community, but it's okay for them to live in some other country's community. I find that distasteful.
But you're saying it could be beyond that cohort. It could be, any non-citizen the government wants to deport?
Well, it's defined that way, but for all practical reasons, why would you deport someone to a third country and pay that third country to take them if you could remove them to their home country?
Yeah, exactly. So it's most likely going to be that cohort that are proving difficult and politically problematic for the government gets them off their hands by paying a third country to take them. Is that going to be legal?
That's a very good question. This will be subject to legal challenge, and I think there will be issues the High Court will have with this, including in terms of Australia's international obligations. But I'm sure the government has had advice on these bills. It has had time to put them together. I assume the advice is solid.
So that's one of the three. Another is the travel ban, if we can call it that. The government can look at a particular country, say Iran, that won't take back its own citizens who refuse to go back, and say, look, none of you are allowed to come in. It tried to do this earlier in the year, and I think the Coalition at the time, along with the Greens, said no, but now minds have changed, it would appear. Is that how it works? They can simply declare a country a banned arrival country?
That's essentially it. My suspicion is they won't actually do that.
Right.
I think what they'll do is use it as a negotiating tool. So they will put pressure on those countries and say, if you don't start to cooperate, this will happen. And let's see how it goes from there. I think the opposition is calling for these countries to be named immediately and action to be taken immediately. I don't see that as happening. I think there is a long negotiation process to go on.
I mean, is there any sense of whether Iran would be willing to negotiate on something like this?
I would be surprised if they would. They have been, they've had this position now for a very, very long time. I remember making 2 trips to Iran myself in order to negotiate with them.
And they take a pretty firm view?
They take a pretty firm view. I mean, they're extraordinarily polite. And they always said everything, oh, yes, we understand. And on the surface, it appeared they were going to cooperate, but the cooperation didn't last for very long.
So they simply just say, if our citizens don't want to come back, we won't let them.
That's right.
Right, okay. But the danger, I suppose, of this sort of blanket ban approach is that academics who might want to come and visit Australia, tourists who might want to come and visit, none of them can come.
Yes, it's an extreme step, and that's why I think it is unlikely the government would take it. It's a question of who blinks first.
Then the third of these bills relates to what happens in detention centres. This is the search and seize power. What would that allow the government to do?
The biggest issue here is enabling the government to remove phones from detainees.
Now, why does it want to do that?
In the past, the concern has been to take phones away would mean that people could not contact family, they could not contact their lawyers, and those sorts of things. And the Labor Party opposed that on those grounds. What has happened in the last decade is the composition of people in detention has shifted quite considerably. Today, the vast majority of people in detention are Section 501 character cancellations, people who have committed serious criminal offences.
So, here we're talking about the bikies, for example, that are non-citizens that get thrown into immigration detention. They might have done time, but now they're in immigration detention, awaiting deportation. That's the general cohort, rather than what we would remember from, decades ago, asylum seekers who've made their way here.
That's correct. The number of unauthorised arrivals who are now in detention is relatively small. The number of Section 501 cancellations is much, much larger as a percentage of those in detention. So the situation has shifted, and I presume that is what has led the Labor government to now support what it previously opposed.
And maybe this is a silly question, but why doesn't it want them having phones in detention?
The view would be that these people are using the phones to organise criminal behaviour.
Oh, okay. So drug dealing and so on from behind the fence at the detention centre. But also search powers, I think, as part of this as well, strip searching, for example. That's one of the concerns of the various human rights groups who are worried about this.
Yes, and that also worries me. I think, once again, it would be based on advice from the Australian Border Force, who consider managing this group difficult now, and the strip search powers presumably they think are needed. They would have reasons for that. I don't know what those reasons are. It would be good if they ventilated some of those reasons, because I do think strip searching seems to just go a little bit too far.
Yeah, I mean, the criticism has been they're being called brutal bills, extreme bills, the worst since the White Australia policy. Would you go that far? Do you think they're that extreme?
No, I don't think they're that extreme. I think the number of people it will affect will actually be quite small. The 80,000 figure, I think, is just silly. I think there are reasons for doing this. Whether they go too far or not, I don't know. Certainly comparing it to the White Australia policy is just ridiculous.
And in terms of dealing with the political problem the government's had with that NZYQ cohort, this should allow them to sort that out, even if it involves shoving the problem to another country.
Yes, I think it pushes the problem into the future. I don't think the problem has gone away.
Well, let's then turn to a bill the government has been unable to get through, and that's the cap on foreign student arrivals. Now, this is fascinating because both sides of politics support reducing immigration numbers primarily through reducing foreign student numbers, but the coalition has decided not to support what would be a new power for the minister, the education minister of the day, to set a cap on how many students, providers, universities and so on can bring in. Where does that leave the government? It's going to have to fall back on what's called Ministerial Direction 107. What is that?
So Ministerial Direction 107 directs immigration decision makers to process student visa applications in a certain order. It was brought in at a time the number of offshore student visa applications were absolutely booming, and the ability of immigration processing officers to keep up with that boom was very, very difficult. That is not the situation today. Offshore student applications have fallen very significantly. And as a result, Ministerial Direction 107 doesn't do a great deal. Indeed, in my view, it's probably pretty close to redundant.
What you said there is something I think, I certainly wasn't as aware of. Applications to come have fallen dramatically, have they?
Oh, very much so.
Right.
Offshore applications.
I
must stress it's
right.
Offshore. Onshore applications remain very, very, very strong.
Students who are already here
Yes.
applying for
Yes.
renewals or new student visas.
That's correct. The backlog of onshore student visa applications is at around 110,000,
Right.
an absolutely eye-watering number.
Does that mean if we just give it time, the number of foreign students will generally fall automatically?
It depends on how policy proceeds from here on. So the application numbers have fallen because the government has, over the last 12 or so months, introduced enormous policy tightening, and that's driven the numbers down. That's not to say the numbers will necessarily stay down. It depends on how the government manages it from now on.
So the concern has been with this Ministerial Direction 107 that regional universities hurt the most. Why is that?
That's because the Ministerial Direction 107 gave an advantage to providers who are considered low risk and processed high risk.
The big unis in the cities.
Exactly, exactly. I mean, no government in Australia is ever going to classify Sydney University as high risk, even if they behave appallingly. Whereas regional universities, it seems the government was prepared to classify as high risk, and as a result, they suffered.
Okay. So will it, I mean, I guess this is for the government to answer, but will they stick with this 107 direction, or will they try now to come up with, are there other ways that, what should they be considering? I mean, you've got some thoughts, haven't you, on the best way to bring those student numbers down?
Oh, absolutely. I firstly think caps are bad. I think Mr.
Too blunt, is that the problem?
Think about being the public servant who every year has to referee a fight amongst 1,400 education providers for how many students they will each be allowed each year. It's just a nonsense policy.
It's impossible to do that.
It's just impossible. You're not going to keep fighting those fights. You need to, in a market economy, set minimum benchmarks, set standards, absolutely.
Academic standards?
Academic standards. And that is where we are lacking.
So we should have, I guess, like a Harvard approach, say this is our academic standard to come to Australia to. It would have to differ though, wouldn't it? Sydney Uni compared to a regional university.
You may need to have differential standards, so you may have be prepared to allow a lower standard in a regional university compared to a metro university, but you have to have standards. I think most Australians would be appalled at the idea that domestic students have to go through an ATAR process.
Yeah, they have to meet the standard.
Overseas students do not.
They just have to pay the money.
Exactly. That is just bizarre. That is just, now, universities will come back and say, oh, we have our standards. Don't you worry about that. Yes, but what are those standards? Are you transparent about those standards? And shouldn't those standards be determined by government regulation rather than remain at the discretion of individual providers?
Do you think this, if we did this approach, it would knock out a lot of foreign students who just simply are not going to meet an academic standard?
It would depend on the level at which we set it. I mean, we could set it at an extraordinarily low level. For example, let's say we decide we're going to be 40 percentage points below Harvard. Well, that would let in a lot of students, but I think there'd be some embarrassment amongst universities about such a standard.
Now, Peter Dutton's not supporting this particular bill, but he still wants to reduce those foreign student numbers. And if you listen to the language that he and others in the coalition have used, clearly they do want a bigger reduction, particularly from that group of 8 top-tier universities. The Sydney, Melbourne, big universities that we all know. What happens, how do you do that, and what happens if you do that? Are we risking losing the very students we want to attract to Australia?
Well, firstly, I think Mr Dutton came to the right conclusions for all the wrong reasons. If he wants to use caps and he wants to cap the metro universities at a harsher level, he needs this legislation. So to oppose it on those grounds seems bizarre.
Because he could have an immigration minister of his own, should he be in government, that can set specific caps for those big group of 8 universities.
Well, he'd need the legislation to be able to do that at a provider level. Interestingly, the power to set a cap at an aggregate level already exists. But that's not being used because it would be regarded as too blunt. And so the current government has decided not to use it. And there's been no indication Mr Dutton wants to use it.
So what else can he do?
As I said, I would go down the path of setting minimum standards. So we force universities to go out there and compete for the best students. Make them offers. Show them what you're prepared to provide. Show them the quality of your education. Attract the best. You say you do. Prove it.
Now, students is just one component, I suppose. Peter Dutton wants to, and he's made this very clear, reduce permanent migration by 25%. They've also talked about net overseas migration being lowered by 25%. That includes temporary visitors as well. How achievable are these sort of
Well, let's
targets?
start with the permanent migration. He has said he wants to reduce permanent migration to 140,000 per annum, with 1/3 in the family stream and 2/3 in the skill stream. What he hasn't taken into account is that we are currently experiencing a massive boom in partner applications.
In the family reunion.
In the family reunion category, such that the current government or any future government cannot sustain keeping the limit on family visas that it has currently in place, because that limit is now, and has been since 1989, unlawful.
So hang on, how does that limit work at the moment?
So at the moment, the limit is administratively applied,
Right.
and the Migration Act says you cannot administratively limit the number of partner visas or dependent child visas.
You can't limit
You
them.
cannot. The government is doing it. In my view, it is right at the edges of the law here.
Right. How is it doing it?
It's doing it administratively. It's just instructing decision makers to
knock
manage
out. Right.
to manage the caseload in such a way they don't exceed a certain number. That is, in my view, and I advised the Howard government of this view, that is unlawful. If you want to do that, change the law.
So you'd need a new law that says you can actually limit family reunion visas.
Yes, and it is a law that Parliament has twice refused.
Right.
I don't see Parliament approving it again.
Well,
now.
yeah. But he could take that to an election as a promise to introduce a law that allows them to do that. What about...
Yes, it would be a law that Philip Ruddock described as unconscionable.
Right, there you go. Okay, so you think that's most unlikely. What about the skilled visa stream, though? How possible is it to make the sort of reductions he's talking about?
You could certainly make the reductions in the skilled visa stream, but then you start running into other problems. For example, the dominant occupation in the skilled stream last financial year were nurses. Are we really going to cut back on nurses? I would be surprised.
But we always hear, there's all these yoga instructors and so on. Is that true? That we've got too many of
the yoga instructors is just a political ploy.
Right.
We probably get 1, 2, 3 yoga instructors. It makes zero difference. It is just a furphy.
So mostly we've got nurses in the skilled stream. Construction workers? We need a lot of construction workers right now.
We do need a lot of construction workers, and the government has reduced the pass mark for construction workers to the lowest possible level. So the pass mark for a carpenter is significantly lower than the pass mark, say, for an auditor or an accountant.
We're trying to make it very easy to get construction workers in.
Our problem is we don't attract enough applications from carpenters.
Why not? Too much competition, is there?
Well, one, too much competition for the same people in migrant settlement nations. And secondly, our system for approving the skills of a carpenter are very restrictive unless you are from a Western nation.
Right.
And what the government, whoever's in power, will need to do is to look at that system and fix that. Now, that is hard because it involves bringing in all of the states. It involves bringing in the unions, employer bodies.
And there'd be pushback at lowering the standards of, the electrician, the whatever it is that you go to bring
in. And no one will agree to reducing the standard.
Yeah, okay. All right. So, and the other challenge, I suppose, in reducing the skilled migration intake is the cost that has to the economy. If we need skilled workers, that's going to have a pretty direct flow onto the economy. So you have doubts about whether he can realistically achieve a 25% reduction in permanent migration?
I think he would run into a legal problem as well as an economic problem in reducing the permanent migration stream to the migration to the level that he wants. In terms of reducing net migration to 160,000, and I noticed that in an interview with Laura Tingle, he started to walk that back because, one, it cannot be delivered without a very, very significant weakening of the labour market. And secondly, he would need to take on a range of interest groups, many of whom are really his major supporters.
Are you talking there about the tourism industry? Because you'd have to reduce working holiday visa holders, wouldn't you, significantly to get that number down?
Yes. And that also affects primary production, agriculture, farmers. He would need to tighten the Pacific Labour Agreement workers. He would need to tighten in a number of areas where I think he would run into serious pushback from interest groups.
Yeah, that's interesting. We're yet to see the opposition leader explain exactly how he would achieve these sort of immigration reduction numbers that he's talking about. I guess it's possible he could say, look, we'll work out the detail in government, but we'll set this target, we'll get the department to sort it out, You used to be in the department. How would that go down?
Well, I would very politely explain to the minister which fights he wants to buy, and I would explain the courageous nature of the fights he would be buying.
All right. Well, it's going to be an interesting few months ahead as we perhaps get a few more details on this. And yeah, we know immigration is going to be a hot topic in the campaign. Abul Rizvi, great to talk to you. Thanks for your expertise on
You're
this.
welcome, David.
All right. And if you have any thoughts at all on this conversation, this topic, or indeed the podcast itself, send us a line at insiders@abc.net.au. We will be talking more about those immigration bills on the couch Sunday morning. Hope you can join us then. Bye for now.